Variety of American nationalism. Our timetable is from 1815 to 1828. Stabilizing the growth economy. By the end of the war in 1812, the War of 1812, remember that ends in 1815, allowed the United States to resume economic growth and territorial expansion. It was a post-war boom. Congress enacted to promote manufacturing, which the war cut off imports already began to greatly stimulate. The American textile industry in particular had grown dramatically. Between 1807 and 1815, the total number of cotton spindles in the country increased more than 15-fold, from 8,000 to 130,000. Before the war, the textile factories, mostly in New England, had only produced a yard and thread. The low mill. Okay, wait a minute. The Second Bank of the United States. Wartime experience underlined the need for a national bank, another national bank. The first charter, large number of state banks had issued vast quantities of banknotes, creating a confusing variety of currency, widely different values, and different to tell any banknote was really worth, and counterfeiting was easy. So Congress proposed the Second National Bank in 1816, much like its predecessor in 1791, but with more capital. The National Bank could not forbid states from issuing notes, but its size and power enabled them to compel the bank to issue only sound notes or be forced out of business. The protective tariff. The end of the war suddenly diminished the aspect of American industry. British ships swarmed into American ports, unloaded cargo manufacturing, many prices below cost. In response, in 1816, Congress passed the tariff laws, known as the protective tariffs. Transportation. The National Railroad. In 1807, Congress enacted a law proposed by Thomas Jefferson's administration permitting using revenue from Ohio land sales to finance the National Railroad from the Potomac River to the Ohio. By 1818, the highway ran as far as Willington, Virginia, on the Ohio River and the Lancaster Peak. Financed part by states of Pennsylvania, extended westward to Pennsylvania. At the same time, steam-powered shipping was expanding rapidly, and by 1816, river steam were sailing up the Mississippi to the Ohio River and up the Ohio as far as Pittsburgh. Nevertheless, there were serious gaps in transportation network remained as far as 1812. The British blockade cut off the Atlantic shipping and the coastal roads. Representative John C. Calhoun would use the government funds to finance an internal improvement, but President James Madison, on his last day of office, vetoed it. He believed Congress lacked the authority to fund improvements without constitutional amendment. The reason for westward expansion. The white American population was one of the most important developments of the 19th century. One was population growth that drove people west because of overcrowding. American population had doubled from 5.3 million to 9.6 million. Most Americans were still farming and wanted agricultural land. In the South, the spread of plantation systems limited opportunities for new settlers. Another reason was Western migration, where the West itself was increasingly attracted to white settlers because the land was plentiful. A mobile society. Because of shipping, boats, we became a mobile society, and it made settling go easier. The plantation system of the Old Southwest, cotton and expansion of slavery. The Old South, later known as the Deep South, was an agricultural economy emerged along different lines. Marked for cotton continued to grow. The Old Southwest contained a broad zone of cotton could thrive. The zone became known as the Black Belt region, a region of dark productive oil in Alabama and Mississippi. Wealthy planters soon followed and brought up to clear land. The original settlers moved west. Succeeding the wilderness by no means assured the wealthiest settlers. Many plantation owners did little more to subsidize the new environment. The rapid growth of the Northwest and the Southwest resulted in the admission of 4 states: Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1919. Astor's American Fur Company. Almost immediately it opened Northwest Territory. Americans' trade poured into the region quickly to the displaced Indians and Mexican traders. In New Mexico, for example, Missouri merchant William Becknell began in 1821 to offer American manufactured goods for sale, priced considerably below the inferior Mexican goods, and had dominated the market of the past. Mexico effectively lost the market of its own colony and steady traffic of commercial wagons moving back along the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and New Mexico. The fur trade was a wholly new kind of commerce. After the War of 1812, John Jacob Astor, American Fur Company, and others extended their own operations into the Great Lakes area west of the Rockies. At first, the fur trade did most of their business with purchasing pelts from the Indians, but increasingly white trappers entered the region and joined the Iroquois and other Indians in pursuit of beaver and other furs. Trapper or mountain men began to trade fur with the far west in small numbers, but developed an important relation with the existing residents of the West, the Indians and the Mexicans, and altered the character of society. White trappers were mostly young, single men, many who would enter into a sexual relation with Indian or Mexican women, and they also recruited women to help the difficult work of preparing the fur and skinning for trading. In 1822, Andrew and William Ashley founded the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and recruited white trappers to move permanently into the Rockies. The Ashleys dispatched supplies annually to their trappers in exchange for furs and skins, and the arrival of supply trains became an occasion for gathering the scores of mountain men, while some who lived in much year-round considerable isolation. But however the isolation in their daily life, mountain men were closely bonded with the expanding market economy. Exploring the West. Many Americans in the East were only dimly aware of the world of trappers. Stephen H. Long journey up the Platte and South Platte rivers throughout now Nebraska and eastern Colorado discovered the peak that would be named for him. He went westward to Arkansas, which is now Kansas. Long wrote the influential report on his trip, the Zebulon Pike, 15 years before, and between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, almost wholly unfit for civilization. The Great American Desert. The Virginia Dynasty. The expansion of the economy and the growth of the settlement west all reflected the spirit of nationalism. The spirit reflected the time for a well character of national politics. The end of the first party system. Ever since the 1800s, the president seemed to have been possession of Virginians. After 2 terms in office, Jefferson secured the presidential nomination for his Secretary of State, James Madison, and after 2 more terms, Madison did the same for his Secretary of State, James Monroe. Many of the North expressed their impatience with the so-called Virginia dynasty, but the Republicans had difficulty electing their candidate in 1816. Monroe received 183 ballots in the Electoral College. His Federalist opponents, Rufus King of New York, received only 34. Monroe entered office under what seemed to be a remarkable favorable circumstances with a decline of the Federalist. Monroe's goodwill tour. Soon after his inauguration, Monroe made a goodwill tour throughout the country. In New England, so recently the scene of rabid Federalist discontent, he greatly greeted everyone with enthusiasm. The Columbian Sentinel, the Federalist newspaper of Boston, observed an era of good feeling had arrived, and on the surface at least they seemed to be a case. In 1820, Monroe was reelected without opposition. For all practices purposes, the Federalist Party had ceased to exist. John Quincy Adams, that is the son of John Adams. John Quincy Adams spent most of his life in diplomatic service, becoming Secretary of State. His first challenge was Florida. The United States had already annexed West Florida, but claimed was disputed. Most Americans, moreover, still believed that the nation would gain possession of the entire peninsula. In the meantime, however, events in Florida were taking place on their own. Andrew Jackson, now in command of the American troops of Florida frontier, had ordered the Secretary of War Calhoun to adopt all necessary measures to stop the continuing raid on American territory by the Seminole Indians in the South. Jackson used those orders to execute the invasion of Florida and seized the Spanish fort at St. Mark's and Pensacola, and the operation became known as the Seminole War. The Adams-Oneida Treaty. Oneida realized, therefore, that he had little choice but to negotiate this settlement, and under the provisions of the Adams-Oneida Treaty in 1819, Spanish seceded all Florida to the United States and gave up claims to its territory north of the 42nd parallel of the Pacific Northwest. In return, American government gave up the claim to Texas for a time. The Panic of 1819. Under the Monroe administration, little time to reveal of its diplomatic success. They were facing a serious economic crisis, the Panic of 1819. The ability to ease credit to settlers from the government, from the banks and wildcat banks, and from a time rechartered the Bank of the United States, fueled under a land boom. In the beginning of 1819, however, new management of the bank began to tighten credit, calling in loans, foreclosing mortgages. A series of failures by state banks resulted in financial panic, and a 6-year depression followed. The Missouri Compromise. When Missouri applied for admission to the Union in 1819, slavery was already well established there. Even so, Republican Talmadge Jr. of New York proposed the amendment that Missouri Statehood Bill would be prohibited with any further induction of slavery into Missouri and provided a gradual emancipation for those already there. Talmadge amendment provoked controversy that raged for the next 2 years. Since the beginning of the Republic, new states had come into the Union, most pairs, one from the north and another from the south, and in 1819 there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. The admission of Missouri would upset the balance, hence the controversy over slavery in Missouri. The crisis averted. Complications with Missouri questions the admissions of Maine as a new and free. Speaker of the House Henry Clay informed the northern members that they would block Missouri from entering the Union as a slave state. Southerners would block the admission of Maine, but ultimately the senators agreed to combine Maine and Missouri proposal into a single bill, and Maine would be remitted as a free state and Missouri a slave state. Senator Thomas from Illinois proposed the amendment prohibiting slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the boundary of the Missouri, the 3630 parallel. The Senate adopted Thomas's amendment, and Speaker Clay, with great difficulty, guided the amendment Maine-Missouri bill throughout the House. Nationalists in both the North and South held this element, which became known as the Missouri Compromise, and former President Thomas Jefferson, less convinced of the sectional harmony would last. John Marshall served Chief Justice from 1801 to 1803. And he did a couple things. And one of the things was Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819. Further expansion of the meaning of contract clause of the Constitution. Having gained control of New Hampshire state government, Republicans tried to devise Dartmouth College charter and convert a private college into a state university. Daniel Webster argued that the college case, Dartmouth charter, he insisted, was a contract protected by the same doctrine the court had already upheld in Fletcher versus Peck in 1910. And then the Fletcher versus Peck, Marshall defended the contract arose out of notorious land fraud of Georgia, and the court decided that whether Georgia's legislators in 1796 could repeal the actions of previous legislation granting lands under shady circumstances in the Lazoo land companies. The court ruled for Dartmouth, proclaiming a corporation charter such as one of the colonist legislators granted the colleges were contract and thus inviolate. The decision placed an important restriction on the ability of state governments to control corporations. McCulloch versus Maryland was an implied powers in 1819. Congress upholding the the Bank of the United States. The bank had become so unpopular in the South and the West that several states tried to drive branches out of business. The case presented two constitutional questions to the Supreme Court. Could Congress charter a bank, and if so, could individual states ban it or tax it? Daniel Weber, one of the bank's attorneys, argued the establishment of the Constitution necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, and the power to tax was a power to destroy. If the states could tax the bank at all, they could tax it to death. Marshall adopted Webster's words in deciding for the banks. In the case of Gibden versus Ogden, in 1824, the court strengthened Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. The state of New York granted a steamboat company, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston, exclusive rights to carry passengers on the Hudson River to New York. Fulton and Livingston gave Aaron Ogden the business to carry passengers across the river between New York and New Jersey. But Thomas Gibden, who had a license granted by Congress, began to compete with Ogden for the ferry traffic. Ogden brought the suit against him and won in New York courts. Gibden appealed to the Supreme Court. Most important question facing the justices is where Congress had the power to give Gibden's a license superseded the state of New York's power to grant Ogden a monopoly. Marshall claimed that the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce, which he said included navigation, was complete in itself and might exercise its utmost extent. Ogden's state granted monopoly, therefore it was void. The highly national decision of the Marshall courts established supremacy of federal government over the states in regulating the economy and openly for the increasing federal role of promoting the economy. They protected corporations and other private economic institutions from local government interference. Johnson versus McIntosh. Leaders of Illinois and Pinkeshaw tribes had sold parcels of their land to a group of white settlers, but had later signed a treaty with the federal government seceding territory which included the same parcel of land to the United States. The government proceeded to grant homeowners the right to the new white settlers, among them McIntosh, on the land claimed by Johnson. The court asked the decision to claim precedence. Marshall's ruling, not surprisingly, favored the United States, but in explaining it, he offered a preliminary definition that placed the Indians within the nation, the tribes with basic rights to tribal land. He said precedence of all American law. Individual American citizens could not buy or take lands from the tribe, and the federal government, the supreme authority, could do so. So then you have Worcester versus Georgia. Even more importantly was a court case in 1832, the decision of Worcester versus Georgia, in which the court invalidated the Georgia law which attempted to regulate the access to U.S. citizens to Cherokee country. Only the federal government could do so, Marshall claimed. The tribes, he explained, were the sovereign entity, the same as Georgia was a sovereign entity, distinct political communities having territorial boundaries within each other, authority and exceeding the right of tribes to remain free from the authority of state government. Tribal rights were affirmed. Marshall's decision, therefore, did what the Constitution itself had not: defined the place for Indian tribes within American political system. The tribes had basic property. They were sovereign entities not subject to the authority of state government, but the federal government, like guardmen, guarding its word, the boundaries of the tribes. The Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, Monroe went further in announcing the policy of ultimately being known as the Monroe Doctrine. Though its primary work of John Quincy Adams, The American Continent, Monroe declared, henceforth is not to be considered a subject for further colonization by the European powers. The United States would consider any foreign challenge to the sovereign existence of American nations as unfriendly act. At the same time, he proclaimed our policy in regards to Europe is not to interfere with internal concerns of any of its powers. The Monroe Doctrine emerged directly out of American relations with Europe in the 1820s. Many Americans feared that Spain, Europeans' allies, notably France, would help Spain retake the lost empire. Even more troubling was the far concerns that Great Britain had designed on Cuba. Monroe and Adams wanted to keep Cuba in Spain's hands until it fell to America's. The Monroe Doctrine had few immediate effects, but an important expression of the growing spirit of nationalism in the United States in the 1820s, and established the idea of the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Revised partisan division. In 1816, the Federal Party has ceased to exist. The Republicans became known as the National Politics Organization of America for a short time. In many ways, resembled a defunct Federalist Party and a commitment for economic growth, central government, but divides were growing. Just as the late century in the 1820s, a two-party system was emerging. The mighty Republican Party split into two parties. One was the Democrat-Republicans, later to become the Democrats, which leaned towards Jeffersonian views, and the Democrats who opposed the federal government's growing economic roles. The other party was the National Republican, later to become known as the Whigs, or the Old Federalist. King Caucus. In 1820, presidential candidates nominated by the party caucus in Congress, but in 1824 the King Caucus was overthrown. The Republican caucus nominated William H. Crawford of Georgia. It favored extreme states' rights of the party, but other candidates received nomination from state legislators and endorsed the irregular mass meetings throughout the country. One of them was the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, but he was a man of cold, forbidding manner with little popular appeal. Another contender was Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. He had devoted personal following and defined a coherent program, the American System, which proposed creating a great home for market, factory, and for foreign products by raising productive tariffs, strengthening the national bank, and financing internal improvements. Andrew Jackson was the fourth candidate with no significant political record. Even though he was a new member of the United States Senate, he was a military hero and helped shrewd political allies in his home state of Tennessee. Jackson received more popular and electoral votes than any other candidate, but did not get the majority. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution, passed aftermath of the contested 1800 election, required the House of Representatives to choose among the three candidates with the largest number of electoral votes. Crawford was seriously ill. Clay was out of the running, but he was the strongest position to influence the results. Jackson was Clay's most dangerous political rival in the West, so Clay supported Adams, in part because Adams was an errant nationalist and likely supporter of American system. With Clay endorsement, Adams won in the House. Jackson believed that there's large popularity and electoral plurality entitled their candidate to presidency, and they were enraged when he lost. But they grew angrier still when Adams named Clay as his Secretary of State. The State Department has well established a route for presidency, and Adams thus to be appeared naming Clay as his own successor. The outrage of Jacksonian expression was a corporate bargaining haunted Adams throughout his presidency. Adams' second presidency. Adams proposed the national program reminiscent to Clay's American system, but Jacksonians in Congress blocked most of it. Adams also experienced diplomatic frustrations. He appointed delegates to internal conferences in Venezuela, Labrador, Bavaria, and called in Panama in 1820, but Haiti was one of the participating nations in the South, opposed the idea of white Americans mingling with black delegates. Congress delayed approving the Panama missions, so the American delegation did not arrive until after the conference was over. More damaging was the tariff in 1828 on imported goods. The measure originated by the demands of the New England wood manufacturers to win support for the middle and western states' admissions. Adams signed the bill, earning the South, who cursed the tariff. So then Jackson runs again in 1828. The new party system was now in place. On one side stood the supporters of John Quincy Adams and the National Republic. Opposing them were the followers Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. Adams attracted support of most of the remaining Federalists. Jackson appealed to the broad coalition of economic aristocrats. But the issue seemed little to end. The campaign disintegrated into a personal attacks. Jackson charged Adams with being guilty of gross waste and extravagance. Adams supporters hurled accusations at Jackson. They called him a murderer and a coffin handbailer, which listed within the coffin shapes outlines the name of Minuteman who Jackson had said had shot in cold blood during the War of 1812. The men had been deserters and were legally executed after their sentence in a court-martial. They called his wife a polygamist. Jackson had married his beloved Rachel at the time when the pair incorrectly believed her first husband had divorced her. When Jackson's wife read the accusations against her, she collapsed and within a few weeks died. Jackson's victory was decisive and sectional. Adams swept all of the New England and showed significant strength in the Mid-Atlantic region. Nevertheless, Jackson considered his victory a complete important of Jefferson's in the 1800s. Once again, forces of privilege had been driven from Washington. Once again, champions of democracy would occupy the White House. America had entered, some claimed, the new era, the era of the common man. Okay. Make sure you take your test for Chapter 7 and Chapter 8.